I'm Hannah Cole, 29 years old, and on the morning my grandfather was laid out in a polished oak casket, I sat in the third pew of a nearly empty church, listening to my relatives whisper that the world was better off without him. The stained glass threw soft colors across faces that wouldn't look at the front because no one wanted to pretend they were grieving a man they'd spent years calling a miser and a tyrant. The air felt heavy, like even the organ was holding its breath, waiting for someone to say something kind and finding nothing to work with. When the pastor finally asked if anyone wished to share a few words about Walter Grayson, the silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat echoing against the stone walls. Every eye slid away down to purses and cufflinks and folded hands because they were here for paperwork, not memories. My legs shook as I realized that if I didn't stand up, my grandfather would go into the ground with nothing but that cold silence to follow him. I had no idea that by the time I sat back down, what I said today and what a stranger in a gray suit was about to reveal would turn all of our lives inside out. Before I go any further, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and tap that like and subscribe button if you've ever been the only one willing to speak up when your own family stayed quiet. My name is Hannah, and for a long time the only version of me that mattered to anyone was the girl whose parents died in a plane crash. Before that label wrapped itself around my life, things were simple in a way I didn't appreciate until it was gone. We lived in a small, split-level house on the edge of a Midwestern suburb with a patchy lawn my dad kept trying to fix and a maple tree out front that dropped red leaves all over the driveway every fall. My dad, Mark, flew passengers across the country in a blue and white uniform that always smelled faintly of jet fuel and coffee when he hugged me goodnight, and my mom, Linda, flew smaller cargo routes and came home with stories about thunderstorms and sunrises above the clouds. We weren't rich, not even close, but we had movie nights with popcorn in mismatched bowls, Sunday pancakes shaped like animals that never quite looked right, and a rusty-colored mutt named appropriately Rusty, who believed every lap in the house belonged to him. My parents worked hard, but they never made it feel like we were chasing money. What they talked about at the dinner table was showing up on time, telling the truth, even when you messed up, and saying thank you to the people who bagged your groceries or mopped the floors at the mall. My mom kept watercolor paintings taped to the hallway walls, all soft blues and greens, that made our little house feel bigger than it was. And my dad had a way of walking in the door, setting down his flight bag, and turning even a Tuesday into something worth celebrating just because we were together. They taught me that a good life wasn't about what you owned, it was about who you loved and how you treated people when no one was watching. Looking back, that tiny world of secondhand furniture and homemade birthday cakes was the richest I have ever felt. There was another world, though, that always seemed far away from our cluttered kitchen table, and his name was spoken like a warning instead of an invitation. My mother's father, Walter Grayson, lived 3 hours away on a piece of land my mom simply called the farm, and she almost never talked about him. When his name did come up, it was in quiet, clipped sentences, how he'd worked himself half to death after his wife passed, how he didn't believe in handouts, how it's just better this way. I knew there had been fights years before I was born about choices my mother made and expectations he had for her. All I ever saw of him growing up were a couple of old black and white photos in a shoebox, a tall, unsmiling man in worn work clothes standing next to a tractor, the sky behind him flat and empty. As a kid, I decided he was like those pictures, hard gray and very far away. If my parents worried about money, they never let me see it. There were nights when my mother sat at the kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of bills rubbing her forehead, but the moment I walked in, she'd cover the papers with her sketchbook and ask how my day was. My dad picked up extra flights when he could, joking that the planes missed him too much if he stayed home for more than 3 days. We didn't take big vacations. Our summer trips were to the lake an hour away, piling into the car with a cooler of sandwiches and a beach towel that always smelled faintly of sunscreen year-round. I knew kids at school who flew to Florida or Europe. I knew our lives were smaller. But I also knew that every time I opened the front door, 2 people would be glad I was there, and that felt like more than enough. That fall when I was 12, the air turned colder a little earlier than usual, and with it came a stretch of days when both of my parents were on overlapping routes. They joked that our family calendar looked like an air traffic control screen, but they still carved out pockets of time to sit on the couch with me, Rusty's head in my lap, and watch movies we'd all seen a dozen times. On the last night before they left together for what was supposed to be a short run out west, my mom stood in the doorway of my room a little longer than usual. She straightened the quilt at the end of my bed, smoothed my hair back from my face, and told me again that no matter where they were flying home was the picture they carried in their minds of me, safe and sound, waiting for them. My dad tapped the light switch twice, his silly habit, and promised we'd do pancakes the morning they got back. The next day the house felt too quiet, with both of them gone, but I was old enough to stay with Rusty and a neighbor checking in on me. I did my homework at the kitchen table, reheated leftover spaghetti, and tried not to count the hours until their flight was supposed to land. The TV in the living room murmured in the background more for company than anything else. Flashes of weather maps and traffic reports I wasn't really watching. Sometime after dark, when the streetlights had turned the window glass into flat black mirrors and Rusty's ears had perked up at every car that passed, the doorbell rang. I wiped my hands on a dish towel, expecting Mrs. Alvarez from next door, and instead opened the door to find two uniformed officers on the porch, hats in their hands, their faces carefully arranged in that solemn way you never want to see directed at you. Even before either of them spoke, something inside me knew that whatever they were about to say would draw a hard line straight through my life, with everything before on one side and everything after on the other. The two officers stood on our porch with their hats pressed against their chests, and the way they waited for me to speak first told me more than their words ever could. They asked if they could come inside, their voices low and careful, and the moment I stepped back to let them in, it felt like the warmth of our little house drifted out past them into the cold night air. Rusty paced in a slow circle at their feet, whining under his breath like he sensed what was coming. One of the officers glanced toward the family photos on the wall, the ones where my parents were smiling in their uniforms, arms around each other, and he let out a quiet sigh before he told me there had been an accident. He explained that the weather had shifted unexpectedly over the mountains, that the aircraft went down before anyone could divert it, and that the crew list confirmed both of my parents had been on board. The rest of what he said blurred together, and I only remember holding the edge of the counter to stay upright, while the room seemed to tilt around me. I don't remember crying, not then. It felt like someone had pressed a hand over my heart, and everything inside had stopped moving at once. A neighbor arrived soon after the officers left, having seen their patrol car outside, and she stayed until my Aunt Denise drove in from 2 towns over. Denise was the kind of person who made fast decisions, and the moment she walked through the door, she started gathering my things into bags without asking which ones I wanted to keep. She said it wasn't safe for me to stay alone, that she would handle everything, and that we would figure out the rest later. The house looked smaller as we pulled away, dim light pooling in the windows like it was trying to follow me. I watched it disappear around the corner, still half expecting to see my dad's car pull into the driveway, and my mom wave from the passenger seat, insisting they were late because of a delayed landing or a broken luggage cart or some ordinary thing that made sense in the world I knew. The next morning, Denise sat across from a social worker at a small desk in a county office, and I remember the way they both used the word orphan like it belonged to someone older, someone with a story behind them. Denise explained that she was my only living relative on my mother's side and that she could take me in right away. Her voice sounded steady and polite, but her eyes kept drifting to a manila folder the social worker had placed between them. When the woman asked if my parents had left any life insurance or assets that could help with my care, Denise leaned forward, her expression tightening as if the question struck a nerve. She said she didn't know anything yet, but she planned to find out, and the way she said it made it clear she expected something to be there. I sat quietly in the corner chair, hands clasped in my lap, waiting for someone to tell me where I was supposed to go next. We drove for hours after leaving that office, the highway growing emptier the farther we went. Denise didn't speak much, and when she did, it was mostly practical things, how school transfers worked, how temporary guardianship paperwork would be processed, and how she hoped I would adjust quickly. The landscape changed from neighborhoods to long stretches of open fields, then to quiet towns with faded storefronts. By late afternoon, we reached a place where the main road narrowed into a single lane with a blinking yellow light hanging above it. Denise kept her eyes on the windshield, as if she didn't want to look at the buildings lining the street, old wooden porches sagging under their own weight, a diner with half its letters missing, and a feed store that looked like it hadn't had a fresh coat of paint in decades. She turned off that road and followed a gravel path out toward the edge of town. The farmhouse appeared slowly through a line of wind-worn trees, its roof patched in places, and its siding faded to a washed-out gray. A wire fence rattled in the wind, and a tall figure stood on the porch, hands tucked behind his back. Denise tightened her grip on the steering wheel as we approached, and when she put the car in park, she told me to gather my things and stay close. I stepped out with my bag slung over my shoulder, the gravel shifting under my shoes, and the faint smell of hay drifting from the barn in the distance. The man on the porch didn't walk down to meet us. He waited until we reached the steps, before he nodded once his jaw set, as he looked at me with pale, unreadable eyes. This was my grandfather, Walter Grayson, a man I had only seen in a few old photographs and never met in person. Denise introduced me quickly, almost briskly, and then asked if he had room for me until she sorted things out. Walter didn't answer her question directly. He simply stepped aside and told me to bring my bags inside. His voice was firm, not unkind but not warm either, as if he was accustomed to being obeyed without hesitation. Denise hesitated on the porch, her gaze flicking between him and me, but when she finally turned to leave, she only told me to call her once I was settled. She didn't come inside, not even for a moment. The inside of the house was dim, lit mostly by the late afternoon sun coming through thin curtains. Walter led me down a narrow hallway without saying much, stopping at a small room with a single bed, a desk, and a wooden dresser that looked handmade. There were no decorations, no photos, not even a rug to soften the creaking floorboards. He told me this would be my room, and that breakfast was served at 6. After that, he reminded me that chores began early on a working farm and that there was no time for sleeping in. Then he left me alone, the door closing behind him with a soft latch that made the whole room feel even quieter. I set my bag on the bed and sat beside it, listening to the sounds of the house, the hum of the old refrigerator, the ticking of a clock somewhere down the hall, and the distant rustle of animals outside. Everything felt unfamiliar, from the smell of worn timber to the way the silence settled into the corners. I ran my fingers across the quilt folded at the foot of the bed, its fabric stiff from years of washing, and tried to imagine how long I would be here, or what life was supposed to look like now that everything had changed. That first night, Walter didn't come check on me or ask if I needed anything. We barely spoke during the simple dinner he prepared, and I followed his lead, eating quietly at the far end of the table while he remained focused on his plate. When he finished, he stood, rinsed his dishes in the sink, and told me to rest because the morning came early. I nodded and did the same, carrying my plate carefully to the sink, unsure whether I was doing it right or if there were rules I had yet to learn. As the house grew darker, I lay on the bed staring at the ceiling, the weight of the day settling in slowly. The room felt colder once the sun disappeared, and I pulled the thin blanket up to my chin. Rusty wasn't curled at my feet. My parents weren't down the hall, and the familiar hum of city life was replaced by the distant call of an owl somewhere beyond the barn. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the warmth of my mother's voice and the way my father tapped the light switch before leaving a room, holding on to those small memories like a lifeline. Somewhere in that quiet, with only the wind brushing against the old siding, I realized that my life had not only changed, it had narrowed. The world I knew had been replaced by one that ran on strict schedules and unspoken expectations, and I wasn't sure yet where I was supposed to fit into it. I didn't know then how quickly those expectations would shape the days ahead, or how the silence in that farmhouse would become the backdrop to a new kind of life I never imagined. But as I drifted into an uneasy sleep, I felt the first hint of the distance between the girl I had been and the girl I was about to become, and that distance would only grow in the days waiting for me just beyond dawn. The next morning arrived with the sharp clang of an alarm that echoed down the hallway, jarring me awake before I understood where I was. Pale light filtered through the thin curtains, painting the room in muted shades of gray. I slipped out of bed and stepped onto the cool floorboards, the quiet of the house settling heavily around me. When I opened my door, I found Walter already moving through the kitchen with slow, deliberate motions, as if he had been awake for hours. He didn't greet me. He only pointed to a bowl of oatmeal on the far end of the table. I sat where he directed, keeping my hands close to the edge of the bowl, and listened to the scrape of his spoon against ceramic as he finished his breakfast in silence. Afterward, he stood and gestured toward the back door, telling me we had work to do. The air outside was crisp, carrying the smell of hay and damp earth, and the barn loomed in the distance with its faded boards worn from weather and time. He handed me a pair of gloves that were several sizes too large and showed me how to feed the animals, how to scrape old straw from the stalls, and how to shovel out the areas that needed cleaning. He demonstrated each task once, then stepped back so I could do the rest. I struggled with the heavy tools, the weight of them unfamiliar, and more than once I felt his gaze on me when I paused too long. He didn't raise his voice, but he reminded me that the work didn't finish itself and that the animals needed attention before the sun fully rose. By late morning, my hands ached from gripping the shovel and my shoulders burned from carrying buckets across the uneven ground. Walter moved from task to task with steady ease, never slowing, never wasting emotion. If he noticed the fatigue in my steps, he didn't mention it. When we finally paused, he told me to return to the house and wash up before lunch. Inside, I let the water run over my sore palms, watching dirt swirl down the drain until the sink was clean again. The meal was simple bread and stew, and we ate quietly, the ticking of the clock filling the space between us. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that left little room for anything beyond the chores and the routines Walter expected. Each morning began before dawn, and the work carried us through until the late afternoon. I learned how to patch small areas of the fence, how to carry bundles of hay without dropping them, and how to stack firewood so it wouldn't topple. When I moved too slowly or lost focus, Walter corrected me with short-clipped instructions. If I asked questions, he answered only what was necessary, his tone firm but not unkind. He didn't explain why things were done a certain way unless it affected the task at hand. Evenings were no different. We ate at the same seats every night, and after washing the dishes, he retreated to a small room near the back of the house, leaving me to finish any lingering chores before bedtime. My world became the barn, the shed, the fields, and the steady rhythm of work that filled each hour. When I lay down at night, my muscles throbbed from exhaustion, and the quiet house seemed to press in around me until sleep finally pulled me under. What I missed most in those early months wasn't the comfort of my old home or even the familiar sounds of suburban life. It was the warmth of having someone nearby who cared about the small details, how my day went, what I was feeling, whether I slept well or needed a hand with something. Walter didn't ask those questions. He didn't check on me when I coughed through dinner one night or when I came in with scraped knees after slipping in the barn. He offered a cloth for the cut and nothing more. I tried to reach for familiar memories when the loneliness swelled, but even those felt distant in the dim quiet of the farmhouse. School was another challenge. Walter insisted I finish my assignments after dinner, stopping by the doorway to make sure I wasn't drifting off or leaving work undone. Some nights I worked until my eyes blurred the numbers and words swimming together. If I earned a low grade, he didn't scold me, but he did place the paper on the table and tell me that time wasted on mistakes had a way of catching up. His voice wasn't harsh, but it carried the weight of someone who expected more, even if he didn't say it outright. When winter arrived, the cold settled into the house so deeply it felt like a second skin. Walter had me chop wood with him, lifting the axe carefully as he demonstrated the right angle and speed. My arms shook with each swing until the motion became more fluid, and even then I stumbled often, adjusting my stance under his watchful eye. Snowstorms rolled across the fields, and we slogged through drifts to check on the animals, brushing frost from their coats and making sure the water troughs hadn't frozen solid. The wind cut through our jackets, stinging my cheeks until they were raw, but Walter pressed on, showing me how to work with the weather instead of against it. One evening, after a long day spent repairing part of the barn roof, I reached the kitchen, too tired to finish clearing the dinner plates. I left them soaking in the sink, telling myself I'd wash them before school the next morning. I crawled into bed with sore hands and heavy eyelids, expecting to fall asleep immediately. Instead, a short while later, I woke to the sound of deliberate footsteps moving toward my room. When Walter appeared in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the hallway light, he held a pair of rubber gloves and motioned for me to get up. He told me calmly that leaving work unfinished led to bigger problems later. His tone wasn't angry, but the firm reminder cut through the fog of my exhaustion. I followed him to the kitchen, washed the dishes under cold water, and returned to bed without another word. As the months passed, I learned to anticipate what needed to be done without waiting for instructions. I woke before the alarm, sometimes eager to start the chores early so I could finish my homework before bed. I began to understand the rhythm of the animals and the land, how small changes in weather affected the day's work, and how Walter's quiet presence filled each hour. He didn't praise me, but he stopped correcting me as often, and that shift, subtle as it was, helped steady the days. Still, the hard edges of that life pressed against my memories of the home I once had. When I passed the hallway mirror, I sometimes paused, studying the girl reflected back, hair tucked under a knitted cap, cheeks wind-chapped, hands calloused. She felt familiar, yet distant-shaped by mornings spent in the cold and nights wrapped in quiet. I whispered my parents' names sometimes before falling asleep, not out of habit, but to keep the sound of them alive in the stillness. Every now and then Walter would leave a task for me with a note on the kitchen table: feed the animals early, stack wood behind the shed, clear branches after a windstorm. Each note was short, written in a careful hand, and spoke more clearly than his voice ever did. It wasn't affection, but it was a kind of trust, and I folded each slip of paper into a small box in my dresser, keeping them without knowing exactly why. The loneliness didn't fade, but it settled into a place I could manage. I learned to carry it the same way I carried buckets of water or bundles of hay, one step at a time, without thinking too far ahead. What I didn't know then was that these slow, quiet months were shaping something inside me that I wouldn't recognize until much later. The farm became a world where every action mattered, where the smallest mistakes had consequences, and where the silence taught me things I hadn't expected to learn. By the time spring came and the frost began to lift from the fields, I could feel the first hints of change rising with the warmer wind. It wasn't loud or obvious, but it stirred just enough to let me know the life I'd stepped into wasn't finished shifting yet. Something in that season of early sunlight and thawed earth was preparing me for what waited ahead, something I couldn't see yet, but would soon understand in ways that changed everything. Spring settled over the farm with cool mornings and long patches of sunlight loosening the ground that had held tight through winter. The shift in the air made the days feel lighter, and for the first time in months, I found myself waking before the alarm, sitting up in bed, already thinking through the work ahead. The routines that once seemed foreign had settled into a steady rhythm, and I moved through each task with a familiarity that surprised me. Walter still spoke in short instructions, but he didn't hover like he had in the beginning. He watched from a distance as I fed the animals, checked the gate latches, or hauled supplies from one shed to the other, stepping in only when something required his expertise. One afternoon, he asked me to help him repair a broken section of the fence near the west field. The boards had warped during a storm, and he wanted them replaced before the animals wandered too close. I held the lumber steady while he lined up the nails, and he nodded after each piece was secured. As we worked, the quiet between us felt less heavy than it once had. The wind carried the smell of budding trees across the open field, and I felt something in me settle, as if the land itself had begun to feel a little more familiar. When we finished, he stepped back and looked over the repairs for a long moment before saying, almost to himself, that it would hold through summer if we kept an eye on it. His voice wasn't warm, but it carried a steadiness that made the moment feel different from the ones before. The days stretched into longer hours as the weather improved, and I found ways to manage my school assignments between chores. I sat at the kitchen table with my books spread out, pencil tapping lightly, while I worked through math problems or read chapters for class. Sometimes I heard Walter moving through the house as I studied the slow creak of floorboards marking his steps, and he would pause in the doorway to make sure I wasn't falling behind. He never asked about tests or projects, but when I carried home graded papers, he set them on the counter without comment, his eyes lingering on the marks for a moment longer each time. One cool evening, he asked if I wanted to help him prepare a new plot in the garden. The rows had been cleared, but the soil needed turning before we could plant anything. He handed me a smaller rake and showed me the pattern he wanted, long, even lines, each one parallel to the last. I followed his example, adjusting my pace to match the steadiness of his movements. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that stretched across the field, and we worked until the sky faded to a soft, dusky blue. When we were done, he tamped the rake into the ground, brushed dirt from his gloves, and nodded once at the neat rows. That small gesture stayed with me long after we walked back to the house. As spring warmed into early summer, I began to see the farm differently. The chores weren't easier, but they felt less overwhelming because I understood their purpose. Each task connected to the next, forming a rhythm that shaped the days. The animals grew familiar with my voice, and the routines became something I could measure time by. I started keeping things organized in my own way, scraps of notes to remind myself of repairs that needed attention, or lists of supplies running low in the shed. I tucked those notes into the same small box where I kept Walter's instructions, the papers stacked neatly by now. One rainy afternoon, while thunder rolled across the distance, Walter showed me how to mend a tear in one of the work gloves. He sat at the table with a needle and thread, the sleeves of his shirt rolled past his elbows, and motioned for me to sit beside him. He demonstrated the stitch once, then placed the glove in my hands. My first attempts were uneven, but he didn't take the work back from me. He folded his hands on the table and let me finish the repair myself. When I finally tied the last knot, he turned the glove over, studying it quietly before offering a soft "good" that carried more weight than the word itself suggested. That quiet encouragement settled in me over the weeks that followed. It didn't erase the loneliness of being far from everything I once knew, but it gave me a different way to see the man who ran the farm with such strict precision. I began noticing the routines he kept, not as rigid habits, but as parts of a life he had lived for decades. He rose before dawn because the animals depended on him. He saved scraps because nothing on the farm could be wasted. He kept his tools in perfect order because a missing bolt or misplaced hammer could cost precious hours. The more I learned about the rhythms of his days, the more I understood the seriousness behind the quiet expectation he carried. He didn't treat work as a burden, but as a responsibility, something earned and maintained every single day. When storms rolled in or a machine broke unexpectedly, he handled the challenges without complaining or delaying them. I watched him repair a broken latch in the rain one evening, water beading on his shoulders as he tightened the final bolt, then turning to me with a quiet reminder that some things couldn't wait for better weather. Over time, I discovered that his sharp silence wasn't the emptiness I once thought it was. It was simply the way he moved through the world, measured, deliberate, and always focused on what needed to be done. As I grew more confident with each task, I found myself matching his pace, taking on more without him needing to remind me. I cleared branches after storms, straightened the tools in the shed without being asked, and made sure the animals had everything they needed before dusk. Each completed task added a small, steadying weight to my days, grounding me in a way I hadn't expected. Still, the quiet moments were the ones that lingered the longest. On warm evenings, I sometimes stood at the edge of the field, watching the sky shift into shades of orange and gold, while Walter finished his work nearby. The fields stretched wide open to the horizon, and for a brief while, the silence felt peaceful instead of heavy. I didn't speak much during those times, and neither did he. But standing there with the sun settling behind the trees, I sensed that this life, for all its hardness, held a rhythm that fit more naturally than I had once believed. One night, as I sat on the edge of my bed brushing the dirt from my jeans, I thought about the girl who had arrived at the farm months earlier, frightened, overwhelmed, unsure of how to navigate this new world. She seemed distant now, almost like a memory of someone else. The routines that once felt like obstacles had become familiar, shaping the long days in a way that steadied me. It wasn't comfort, but it was something close, a sense of belonging that came from doing things right and knowing I could stand on my own. Even so, a part of me wondered where all of this was leading. I didn't know what Walter expected beyond the day's work, or how he saw my place on the farm as time went on. I didn't ask, and he didn't offer explanations. The tasks continued, the seasons shifted, and the silence between us filled the spaces where questions might have been. It was in that silence somewhere between early summer dawns and the long hours of preparing the garden that I felt the first tug of something new, an awareness that this hard-earned strength might carry me farther than I realized. What I couldn't see yet was how that strength would be tested, or how quickly the balance between us would shift when the next season arrived. For now the land was warming beneath our feet, and the steady rhythm of the farm carried us from one day to the next, waiting quietly for the moment when everything would begin to change again. Summer settled heavily over the farm in the months leading up to my 18th birthday. The fields shimmered under long days of heat, and the air inside the house carried the faint smell of hay and old timber that had become so familiar I barely noticed it anymore. By then, the routines that once overwhelmed me had woven themselves into my bones. I woke before dawn, fed the animals without thinking, moved through each task with the same steady rhythm Walter had taught me. I finished my school assignments at the kitchen table while the sun set through the window, and when fall arrived, I graduated near the top of my class. For the first time in years, I looked toward the future and saw something that belonged to me. I had kept my drawings tucked in a worn portfolio beneath my bed, pulling it out late at night when the house was quiet. Sketching had been my one secret piece of home, something that reminded me of my mother's gentle hands guiding mine across a page. When acceptance letters started coming in, I hid them for days, reading each one slowly, as if the words might disappear if I looked too quickly. The best art program in the state offered me a place, and I held the letter to my chest, imagining what life might look like beyond the farm, the studios, the classes, the sense of belonging I had missed for so long. I waited for the right moment to tell Walter, hoping he might understand at least part of why this mattered. The evening of my birthday seemed like the right time. The sky outside had turned a soft shade of gold, and the fields buzzed with the last sounds of summer settling in. Walter sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, the steam rising in gentle curls as he sorted through a stack of papers. I stepped into the room with my report card and the art school letter folded neatly in my hand. My heart beat fast, a familiar mix of nerves and hope tightening my chest. When he looked up, I moved closer and placed the envelope beside his coffee cup. "I got in," I said quietly, "to an art program, the best one in the state." He didn't pick up the letter. He reached instead for the papers he'd been organizing, college brochures and application forms I had never seen before. He slid them toward me, making a small stack at the edge of the table. "These are the schools you'll consider," he said. "You'll study business or finance. Something useful." The words landed heavier than I expected, settling like a stone in the center of my chest. I tried again, softer this time. "I want to paint. I've been working hard, and they offered me a place. This is something I can do well." He shook his head and leaned back in his chair, his expression unmoved. "Painting won't support you. You'll go to a school that prepares you for real work. I won't argue about it." Heat rose in my face, and for a moment I stood frozen, gripping the back of the chair beside me. Months of quiet discipline cracked under the weight of his absolute certainty. Something in me, something steady, something shaped by all the long mornings and hard lessons, rose to the surface before I could stop it. "You don't get to decide that," I said, my voice shaking with the effort to keep it even. "You never asked what I wanted. You never cared what I was good at." Walter straightened his eyes, narrowing slightly. "You're talking like a child. I've given you a home. I've given you work to build your character. I'm telling you the right path, and you'll follow it." The crack widened. I felt every year of silence, every night spent trying to swallow grief because there had never been room for it in this house. The words poured out faster than I could rein them in. "You didn't give me a home," I said, the sound of my own voice startling me. "You gave me work and rules and nothing else. I lost my parents and you told me to get up at 5. I cried once and you told me it was a waste of time. You never asked how I was doing. You never asked what I dreamed of. You just filled the day with chores and called it responsibility." The room felt suddenly smaller, the quiet pressing against us like a storm building behind closed doors. Walter rose from his chair, his jaw tight, hands braced on the table. "I taught you how to survive," he said, his voice low but sharp. "You think dreams will keep you afloat? You think the world cares what you want? Life doesn't bend for feelings." I swallowed hard tears, blurring the edges of the room. "Maybe not," I said. "But neither does this house, and I'm tired of pretending that's enough." He stepped closer, pointing toward the doorway. "If you want to make foolish choices, you'll do it elsewhere. You want freedom, go. But don't come back asking for help when you realize what you've thrown away." The words rang through the kitchen with a finality that left the air completely still. Something inside me broke wide open, not from anger, but from the realization that no amount of proving myself would bridge the gap between us. I turned away before he could see the tears fall, grabbing my old backpack from my room and stuffing it with whatever clothes I could reach. I tucked my parents' photo between two shirts, zipped the bag shut, and slipped out the front door. The night air was cool, the gravel crunching under my feet as I walked toward the road. I didn't have a plan, only the desperate need to put distance between myself and the house that had shaped me so completely. The sky stretched wide above me, streaked with fading shades of blue, and the fields felt larger in the darkness. Each step carried a mixture of fear and relief, as if I were shedding the weight of years with every mile I put behind me. I walked until my legs throbbed, until the sounds of the farm disappeared into the quiet hum of insects and the distant rustle of wind through the trees. When I finally stopped, I found a spot beneath an old oak tree by the roadside and sank down against its trunk. My breath came in uneven bursts, and the tears I had held back for so long finally spilled freely. The anger that had propelled me out the door dimmed slowly, leaving a deep ache in its place. I sat there for hours, the night settling around me in thick layers of quiet. As the sky shifted from deep blue to a muted gray, the first hints of morning crept across the fields. My backpack rested beside me, the zipper slightly open where my mother's photo peeked through. The same lessons I had tried so hard to reject hours earlier began to turn over in my mind. Discipline, perseverance, responsibility, familiar reminders tucked into the corners of memory. By the time the sun finally rose, painting the horizon in soft gold, a different heaviness settled in my chest. Not anger this time, but regret so sharp it cut through the remnants of the night. I pushed myself to my feet, brushed off the leaves and dirt, and started walking back toward the farm. I didn't know what I would say when I reached the door, or whether Walter would even let me in, but the thought of leaving things unresolved pulled me forward. I rehearsed an apology in my mind, simple words that felt too small for everything they needed to cover. When the farmhouse came into view, the roof lines silhouetted against the brightening sky, I felt my heart lift and sink at the same time. I reached for the doorknob and pushed gently, expecting the familiar creak and the scent of coffee drifting from the kitchen. Instead, the house was still too still. No footsteps, no sounds from the barn, no soft scrape of a chair being pulled out. It took only a few moments to find him on the kitchen floor, one hand curled loosely around his old leather notebook. His eyes were closed, his face peaceful in a way I had never seen, and the quiet that filled the room was deeper than anything I had felt in all my years on the farm. I knelt beside him, my hands trembling, and reached for his shoulder, calling his name in a voice that broke apart before it finished. The doctor would later call it a stroke, quick and final happening sometime during the night while the house slept. But in that moment, standing in the kitchen with the morning light spilling across the floor, all I knew was that the last words between us had been spoken in anger, and I would never have the chance to change them. The days that followed moved in slow, steady waves, carrying me through arrangements I never imagined I'd have to make alone. By the time the funeral arrived, the tension in the small church felt as heavy as the closed casket at the front of the room. And though I didn't know it yet, what happened that morning, the silence, the stares, the single moment when I stood up to speak would open the door to truths I had never expected to uncover. The morning of the funeral arrived colder than I expected, the sky washed in a dull gray that made the town feel even smaller than usual. I dressed quietly, pulling my black dress from the back of the closet and smoothing out the fabric with slow, careful hands. The house seemed to echo with each step I took, as if the silence had grown heavier since Walter's passing. When I walked out onto the porch, the wind brushed against my face, carrying the faint scent of earth and hay. I paused there for a moment, letting the air steady me before I climbed into the car and drove toward the church. Inside the rows were sparsely filled with relatives I barely knew, their faces marked with a mixture of curiosity and impatience. They offered stiff nods when I passed, but most kept their eyes fixed on the front of the room where the closed casket rested beneath a spray of white lilies. I sat in the same pew I had chosen during the visitation, hands folded tightly together in my lap. The murmur of whispered conversation drifted through the room, broken up only when someone cleared their throat or shifted uncomfortably in their seat. When the pastor began the service, his voice carried gently through the church, speaking of life legacy and the time we had with those we cared about. I listened quietly, my gaze lingering on the casket, remembering the long days on the farm and the countless tasks Walter had shown me how to complete with steady determination. Near the end of the service, the pastor paused, resting his hands on the podium as he looked out at the scattered faces before him. He asked if anyone wished to come forward to share a few words about Walter's life or the memories they carried. For a moment, no one moved. Shoes tapped lightly against the floor, programs rustled, and a few heads bowed as if they hoped the moment would pass without requiring anything from them. The pastor waited, giving the room time to respond, but the silence only deepened. I felt a slow ache rise in my chest, familiar and sharp, and before I could think too hard about it, I stood. The wooden pew creaked beneath me as I stepped out into the aisle, each footfall soft but certain as I made my way toward the front. At the podium, I rested my hands on the edge, feeling the smooth wood under my fingers. I looked out at the faces turned toward me, some surprised, some politely neutral, and I tried to find the right place to begin. My voice wavered at first, but the words found their way, slowly shaped by years of unspoken moments. I talked about the strict routines on the farm, how Walter had pushed me to learn the value of time and follow-through. I spoke of the lessons hidden in the long days we spent repairing fences, tending to animals, or hauling wood across the yard. None of it sounded graceful or polished, but it was honest, and as I continued, the tremor in my voice faded. When I stepped down, the room had grown quieter, the last words of my eulogy settling into the silence. I returned to my seat, my legs unsteady beneath me, and folded my hands once again in my lap. I didn't expect anything to change, and it didn't not in the room. But inside, something felt different, as if I had finally given shape to the years that had gone unspoken. When the service ended, people filed out slowly, some stopping to express their condolences before stepping into the cold air outside. I remained near the front, gathering my things and steadying myself before leaving. That was when a man approached, with a leather-bound folder tucked under his arm. He introduced himself as Arthur Jennings, an attorney who had worked with Walter for many years. His demeanor was calm, his voice measured as he explained that he needed to speak with me privately regarding the estate. We walked to a small side room near the entrance. The air there felt cooler, quieter, and the soft hum of voices from the hallway faded when the door closed behind us. Arthur set the folder on a small table, opened it carefully, and sifted through several papers before selecting one. He handed it to me and explained that Walter had left clear instructions in his will. I was listed as the sole beneficiary. The words didn't register right away. I stared at the document, reading the lines again to make sure I understood correctly. Arthur continued speaking, telling me that Walter had accumulated far more than anyone realized. The farm had been only a piece of his holdings. There were accounts, investments, properties, all woven into a network he had managed quietly over decades. My stomach tightened as he described the scope of the estate, each detail revealing a life I had never seen. When Arthur finished, he reached into the folder again and pulled out a small, worn notebook with a leather cover. He held it out with both hands, explaining that this was something Walter had asked him to give me personally. I took it carefully, feeling the familiar weight of the leather, its surface smooth from years of being handled. I opened the first page and saw Walter's handwriting, steady, precise, unmistakably his. The entries were brief, small fragments of thoughts written across the pages. The earliest one described the day my parents died, the moment he learned I was coming to live with him. He wrote about not knowing how to raise a child and fearing he would get everything wrong. As I flipped through the pages, each line revealed a new piece of him. Quiet worries, long nights spent, wondering whether his choices had hurt more than helped, and reflections on the responsibilities he carried without complaint. The entries weren't emotional, but they held a weight I felt with every sentence. Near the end of the notebook, I found a passage dated only a few weeks before he died. He wrote about me how much I had grown, how he hoped I would have a life better than his, how he wished he had known how to say things that didn't come naturally to him. His words were simple, direct, and they tightened the space around my heart. I closed the notebook, gently holding it in my lap as I sat there in the quiet room with Arthur watching me patiently from across the table. When I finally stood, Arthur offered his condolences again and handed me several documents with instructions on what would happen next. I thanked him, though the words felt small in the face of everything I had just learned. I stepped outside, the sunlight sharper now as it reflected off the parked cars. The wind carried the faint chill of early winter, tugging gently at the hem of my dress. The notebook felt warm against my palm, as if the years inside it had settled into the leather itself. The drive back to the farm was quiet. The fields stretched out in long, familiar lines, and the house appeared at the top of the road with its weathered boards and familiar shape. I carried the notebook inside and set it on the kitchen table, the same place Walter had once kept his own papers arranged in neat stacks. The room felt different now, filled with shadows of the past and the weight of new understanding that hung between them. That evening, I sat by the small lamp in the corner and read through the notebook again, page by page. The light flickered softly across the ink, casting the handwriting in gentle curves. Each entry felt like a small window into moments I had never witnessed, quiet admissions, difficult choices, and the thoughts he carried alone. When I closed the notebook, I rested my hands on top of it, letting the silence settle around me. The world outside darkened, and a soft breeze brushed against the window pane. Somewhere beyond the barn, an owl called out into the night. I listened to the sound fade into the open fields and realized that the days ahead would carry a new kind of weight, one shaped not only by the work Walter had taught me, but by the truths he had left behind. The farm held more than memories now. It held a legacy I hadn't expected to inherit, and the first steps toward understanding it waited quietly in the days to come. In the days after the funeral, I found myself moving through the farmhouse with a different awareness, as if each room held threads of the life Walter had lived quietly, just beyond my understanding. The notebook rarely left my side, and I read through its pages again each night, letting his careful handwriting fill the silence that had always stretched between us. The words were simple, steady, and sometimes unexpectedly raw, revealing fears he'd never allowed to surface in his voice. With each entry, the sharp edges of our last argument softened, replaced by a clarity I hadn't expected to find. Still, the weight of the estate documents on the kitchen table seemed almost unreal, their numbers and signatures describing a life far larger than the fences that circled the farm. A week later, I drove to the attorney's office to begin sorting through the paperwork. Arthur greeted me with the same composed warmth as before and walked me through each form with patient explanations. He spoke about the accounts, the properties, the long-term investments, all managed with the same precision Walter brought to his daily life. I listened quietly, trying to absorb the details, while still holding on to the notebook that rested in my bag. To Arthur, this was business. To me, it was the first step toward understanding the man I had only begun to know. When the final signatures were complete, Arthur leaned back in his chair and looked at me thoughtfully. He said Walter had been deliberate in arranging everything, wanting to ensure I would have choices he never had. His words settled over me with a gentle weight, and I thanked him before stepping out into the bright afternoon light. The air felt crisp, carrying the scent of distant fields and warm pavement, and I stood there for a moment, letting the reality of it all settle into place. Back at the farm, I gathered my things, slowly moving from room to room as the sun dipped low over the fields. I folded the clothes I would take with me, packed the notebooks I'd filled during my years in school, and sorted through the items that had made the farmhouse feel like home in its own quiet way. When I reached the kitchen, I paused at the table where Walter had kept his own papers arranged in precise stacks. I placed his notebook gently in my bag, feeling the soft imprint of the leather under my fingertips. The house felt different without him still, but not empty. It carried the imprint of his routines, the faint echo of his steps, and the quiet strength he had passed down without ever saying the words aloud. The next morning, I drove to the nearby state university and submitted my enrollment forms for the business program. The decision wasn't made out of obligation. It came from the understanding I had gained while reading Walter's notebook. He wanted me to build a life that could stand firmly on its own, shaped by the values he believed would protect me. The campus buzzed with students moving between buildings, the air lively with conversations and the hum of activity. I felt a familiar nervousness settle in my chest, but beneath it was something steadier, a sense of purpose that had grown quietly through years of early mornings and hard work. Classes began in the fall, and the pace was relentless from the start. I spent long hours in the library reviewing lectures and studying for exams until the words blurred on the page. My part-time job at a coffee shop helped cover the small expenses I didn't want to take from the estate, and I saved every dollar I could. The lessons I'd learned on the farm followed me into the classroom discipline in managing my time, perseverance when the coursework grew dense, and honesty in every assignment I submitted. On nights when the workload felt too heavy or exhaustion tugged at my shoulders, I opened Walter's notebook to the pages where he wrote about building strength through steady effort. The quiet resolve in those lines helped guide me back to my desk each time. Years passed in this steady rhythm: classes, work, study, sleep. And when graduation arrived, I crossed the stage with a sense of calm I hadn't expected. My degree felt like more than a milestone. It felt like the first clear step into a life shaped not by loss, but by the values Walter had woven into each season on the farm. With that foundation, I began planning the business I had imagined during my time in school. I remembered the challenges Walter faced transporting goods to town, the long drives he took in old trucks that groaned under the weight. I wanted to build something that could ease that burden for others, something rooted in the world he knew so well. Using part of the estate, I started a small logistics company dedicated to helping local farms transport their produce to markets. The work was demanding and rarely predictable. Trucks broke down at inconvenient times, deliveries were occasionally delayed, and some clients needed reassurance when schedules shifted unexpectedly. But each setback reminded me of the storms we had weathered on the farm, of the nights Walter fixed equipment in the rain without complaint. I found myself repeating the same steady phrases he had used in those moments, brief, focused, and always guiding the work forward. As the business grew, I expanded the fleet and hired additional drivers, choosing people who understood the rhythms of rural life. Some days I found myself behind the wheel of a delivery truck, navigating long stretches of road with the windows down and the scent of open fields drifting inside. Other days I sat at my desk reviewing invoices and schedules, hearing the faint echo of Walter's voice reminding me that every detail mattered. The company became something I was proud to build, a quiet echo of the life that had shaped me. One crisp autumn afternoon, I drove back to the farm for the first time in months. The fields lay quiet under the soft light, and the house stood just as I remembered it, weathered but steady, each board holding stories only time could tell. I walked the familiar path toward the graveyard beyond the barn, carrying a small bouquet of daisies. The wind brushed through the trees as I stopped at Walter's headstone, the simple markers carved into the granite, softened by the passing seasons. I knelt and placed the flowers at its base, letting my hand rest lightly on the cool stone. Standing there, I felt the long arc of the years settle around me, the grief that once overwhelmed me, the lessons that shaped me, and the gradual understanding that had emerged from the silence he carried. The notebook had revealed a man who wanted to protect me in the only way he knew, and his legacy lived on, not through the wealth he left, but through the strength he encouraged me to build. I whispered a quiet thank you into the open air, the words carried gently by the breeze. As I turned back toward the house, the late afternoon sun cast a warm glow across the fields, illuminating the path ahead. The road that had once felt heavy with uncertainty now stretched out with a steady promise, leading into a life built on resilience, intention, and quiet determination. What I didn't yet know was how far that path would carry me, or how the choices I made in the days ahead would honor the foundation Walter had laid. The next season waited just beyond the horizon, ready to guide the final steps of the journey that began on this land so many years ago. I walked back toward the farmhouse, with the late-day sun stretching long shadows across the gravel, each step quieter than the last. The air had that familiar warmth the land carried at the end of harvest season, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of steadiness settle inside me. The business was running well. The drivers I'd hired had turned into a small team I trusted, and the work felt like a bridge between the life I'd lived with Walter and the one I was building now. Still, nothing grounded me more than returning to the place where everything had first changed. Inside the kitchen, the room looked much like it always had, simple, worn, and open to the soft hum of the old refrigerator. I set my bag on the counter and took a slow breath, letting the quiet fill me the way it used to. The farmhouse didn't hold the same ache as it once did. It felt more like a place that carried the echoes of what I'd learned and the moments that shaped me, both the difficult ones and the ones I didn't recognize as gifts until much later. I walked to the window and looked out across the fields, remembering the mornings I had trudged through frost, the evenings spent mending fences, and the hours of steady work that once felt endless. Now those memories formed a kind of map behind me, showing how far I had come. I stayed at the farm that night, sleeping in my old room with the window cracked slightly so the breeze could carry in the scent of dry grass. The moonlight drifted across the floorboards, and I lay awake for a little while listening to the quiet. I thought about the girl who had arrived here scared and numb, unsure of how to carry the weight of losing her parents or how to fit into a world that didn't slow down for grief. I thought about the teenager who fought hard to find her voice and the young woman who left here with regrets she wasn't sure would ever heal. As I closed my eyes, I realized those versions of me had all been doing the best they could with what they knew at the time. The next morning, I drove out to the small cemetery by the tree line where Walter was buried. The grass had grown evenly around the headstone, and I brushed a few leaves aside before setting a new bouquet of daisies on the ground. The names carved into the stone caught the light, and I let my hand rest gently against the cool granite. Standing there, I felt the years stretch between us, each one carrying a different shade of understanding. I didn't come to explain anything or to rewrite what had happened. I came to acknowledge the truth I had grown into, that the man who raised me hadn't been perfect, but he had given me the tools to build a life that would stand steady long after he was gone. I spoke softly, not because I expected an answer, but because the act of saying the words mattered. I told him the business was doing well, that I was learning to navigate the challenges with the same persistence he had shown in every season. I told him the lessons he taught me, discipline, honesty, responsibility, had turned into the foundation of everything I did. I said I hoped he could see the woman I had become and know that the strength he pushed me to build had carried me farther than either of us could have imagined. When I stepped back and looked across the fields one last time, the breeze moved gently through the branches overhead, and I felt a quiet kind of peace settle in my chest. Driving away from the farm that day, the road ahead felt clearer than it had in years. I knew there would always be days when grief stirred unexpectedly, or when the memory of our last argument would press at my ribs. But I also knew that healing wasn't about erasing the hard parts. It was about learning to hold them with honesty and letting them become part of the whole story instead of defining it. The life I was building now worked. I loved people I trusted. Choices I could claim as my own had grown from both the pain and the strength of the years behind me. By the time I reached town, the morning sun had risen fully, lighting up the quiet streets and the storefronts just beginning to open for the day. I thought about the future and the steps waiting ahead, new routes for the business, new goals, maybe even new chapters I hadn't yet imagined. But I carried something steady with me now, something shaped by both my parents' warmth and my grandfather's unyielding will. I understood that love could take different forms, some gentle and some sharp, and that sometimes the hardest lessons became the ones that stayed with you the longest. As I pulled into my driveway, the morning breeze followed me out of the car, carrying the soft scent of autumn. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the quiet settle over me. Life had come full circle in its own unexpected way, and I felt ready for whatever came next. If you've listened this far, I'd love to hear where this story met you in your own life. Feel free to share a thought or memory in the comments, and if you'd like to hear more stories like this one, I'd be glad to have you along.